Today, we just added 2 new Vietnam War products to our store over at store.armchairhistory.tv. There you can buy a Vietnam uniform infographic or a Vietnam helmet sticker sheet. In addition to these 2 new products, you can find the evolution of US tanks and British uniform posters, a Battle of Fallujah poster, and mugs and t-shirts. Go to store.armchairhistory.tv to support the channel. The US cavalry ride through the jungle, headed for battle. Their horses made of steel, their riders sweltering in flak jackets. The infantrymen inside check their weapons, just like they've been trained. They repeat their briefing in their head just like they've been trained. The pilot comes in for a landing, hovering above the swirling greenery, just like he's been trained. But once the bullets start flying, and the first sap is struck down by a hail of rounds, the soldiers begin to panic as reality sweeps their training aside. This is the Central Highlands of Vietnam, and the first major battle for American forces has begun. But the GIs will find no stand-up fight here, no easy conquest born on the back of their technological supremacy. They will find only horror. Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian. In the early days of direct American involvement in the Vietnam War, strategists planned to use their growing air capabilities to overcome the challenges of operating in the jungles of Vietnam. These innovative tactics were put to the test for the first time in the Battle of Drang, when a US Air Mobile Division fought to push back an assault by the B-3 Front of the North Vietnamese Army on the strategically vital Central Highlands. In the bloody struggle that followed, both sides would ultimately achieve a form of victory. While the Americans accomplished most of their objectives, the battle revealed vulnerabilities in their air mobile tactics, which their tenacious enemies were quick to exploit. In this video, we will look at how the Battle of Ia Drang set the stage for the bloodbath that was the Vietnam War. During the Cold War, both the US and USSR engaged in highly elaborate espionage and spying operations, desperate for even a shred of credible information on their opponents. Though the Cold War is long over now, the internet has opened up a whole new realm of possibilities for bad faith actors to steal your personal information and compromise your digital security. That's why the sponsor of today's video is NordVPN, who are proud to reveal their new dark web monitor, which constantly trawls the underbelly of the internet and alerts you the moment your credentials come under threat. This is of course in addition to all of the regular benefits of a VPN, like privacy online, protection against malware, and the ability to ignore region locking for up to 6 devices on a single subscription. Armchair Historian fans can help support the channel and avail themselves of a special Black Friday discount by going to nordvpn.com/historyvpn to get 73% off of the 2-year plan with 1 additional month for free. That's only $3.16 per month, and all with no risk to you, thanks to Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. By 1965, the United States was rapidly becoming more and more involved in the ongoing conflict between the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the north and the Republic of Vietnam in the south. Fighting up to that point had largely been between the South Vietnamese Army, or ARVN, assisted by CIA-backed militias known as the Civilian Irregular Defense Group, or CIDG, and the Viet Cong, an irregular army of communist insurgents supplied by the North Vietnamese military, or PAVN. One hotly contested area was the Central Highlands region, which served as a vital staging ground and base of operations for both the Viet Cong and regular forces. The CIDG had been struggling to seize control of the highlands for months. and early 1965 saw American Special Forces begin taking a much more active role in the battle. But as these professional troops took over from the militia, the Viet Cong themselves began receiving heavy reinforcements from the PAVN. Both sides saw the necessity of securing the highlands, but it was the Communist forces who would commit to the first large-scale offensive. In July, Major General Chu Hui Man assumed command over 3 regiments from the PAVN 1st Division and began planning an ambitious assault on the American military camp at Pleime, southwest of Pleiku City. Initially, operating as 3 separate groups, one regiment would attack Pleime and pin the defenders down, while a second lurked in ambush for any reinforcements. Once these had been dealt with, the 3rd Regiment would arrive, and all 3 would unite for a final assault on Pleiku City. But just as General Man's audacious plans began to take shape, the Americans threw a wrench into the works by deploying the 1st Cavalry Division to the Central Highlands. This was the first complete US division to enter Vietnam, and Man immediately realized that if they were allowed to reach Pleime Camp, his offensive would be doomed before it even began. Concluding that only decisive action could prevent a swift American victory, General Man rushed to prepare his troops for an assault in mid-October, nearly 3 whole months sooner than anticipated. But by that point, only 2 of his 3 regiments were ready to fight. Even so, with forward elements of the 1st Cavalry Division already arriving in Pleime, Man decided to roll the dice and proceed with the operation. The Pleime camp came under fire on the evening of October 19th, with Man's 33rd Regiment quickly overrunning an outpost to the south and assaulting the camp. By around 1 a.m., PAVN forces had pushed to the perimeter of the main camp, but the defenders held firm and repelled the advancing troops. Around this time, American Captain Harold M. Moore took control of the camp's defense after Pleime's ARVN commander allegedly disappeared into a bunker soon after the attacks began. Moore immediately called for air support, and from around 4 a.m. onward, the U.S. 481st Tactical Fighter Squadron unleashed a continuous barrage of airstrikes that would last for the remainder of the siege, inflicting considerable casualties on the attackers. Over the next 4 days, the Americans continued to exchange fire with the 33rd Regiment, who were sheltering in improvised fortifications in a wide arc to the west of Pleime, with neither side able to gain the upper hand. On October 23rd, several ARVN units under General Win Fu Vinh Loc set out to relieve their American allies. Just as planned, the PAVN 32nd Regiment ambushed the relief column on the way to the camp, fighting viciously into the night before the Vietnamese troops were forced to pull back and return to their HQ. The PAVN ambush succeeded in delaying the relief forces and inflicting heavy casualties, but by the night of October 25th, the South Vietnamese column had reached Pleime and broken the siege. Having failed in their attempt to overrun the Americans at Pleime, the 32nd and 33rd Regiments were forced to retreat to their headquarters further north. The US commanders were eager to pursue their fleeing foes, hoping to put their newly devised air mobility tactics to good use. And so, in close coordination with air support units, 7 sites throughout the Central Highlands were selected as landing zones for air mobile assault groups to stage their attacks. By early November, the plan was ready to proceed. After some small skirmishes in the first weeks of November, the American offensive began in earnest on November 14th. The PAVN 32nd and 33rd Regiments had completed their retreat to fortified positions surrounding the Chu Pong Massif Mountain. South Vietnamese intel suggested that a large portion of these positions were located throughout the nearby Ia Drang Valley, prompting the Americans to prepare the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry to deploy into the valley via a clearing designated Landing Zone X-Ray. The operation was saddled with logistics problems from the beginning, Due to a shortage of service-ready helicopters and a diminished carrying capacity of those that were available, only 80 men could be delivered to the landing zone every half hour. It would take roughly 3 hours to transport the full 431 troops of the 1st Battalion, leaving the first waves dangerously vulnerable while they waited for reinforcements. Even with these risks taken into account, 1st Battalion Commander Colonel Harold Hal Moore, no, not that one, approved the plan, and the Battle of Ia Drang commenced on the morning of November 14th. Preceded by colossal bombardments from howitzers, gunships, and aerial rockets, the first elements of the 1st Battalion were dropped into the valley at 10:48 a.m. As the Americans unloaded their equipment and established a perimeter, one can only imagine their trepidation knowing their enemy could be watching their every move, Kalashnikov ready. However, the enemy in question was instead taken completely by surprise. General Mon was overseeing a supply run away from the front, and his deputy colonel, An, was forced to rush to the battlefield and take command. An did not arrive until around 1 p.m., by which point his men had been haphazardly engaging the Americans for hours and had taken many casualties. Bravo Company had taken advantage of its enemy's disorganization to advance up the slope of Chupong Massif, pushing to within 100 meters of the Pavin 9th Battalion's concentration position before being pinned down by enemy fire. As Alpha Company arrived in full to join the vanguard, the U.S. offensive was proceeding well, and Colonel Moore was quite confident in his imminent victory. So naturally, the situation spiraled out of control in the next 30 minutes. Colonel An rallied his men, and the Americans suddenly faced a coordinated counterattack from further up the mountain. Heavy mortar fire began to rain down on the LZ, and Bravo Company's 2nd Platoon was rapidly cut off and surrounded. Moore scrambled to respond to this sudden reversal of fortune, redirecting elements of Alpha Company to rescue the lost platoon and desperately requesting further air support. Brutal fighting dragged on for the next 2 hours, with both sides taking heavy casualties as the Americans struggled to dislodge the dug-in Pavin from their defensive positions. The volume of fire became so heavy that when the 5th helicopter lift arrived with fresh troops, Moore had to warn the pilots not to attempt a landing for fear of them being shot down. The cut-off 2nd Platoon saw the worst of this brutal fighting, as they struggled to hold their improvised perimeter against wave after wave of Pavin troops. To make matters worse, the platoon's commander was killed, leaving Sergeant Clyde E. Savage to lead their desperate fight for survival. None of the men sent to rescue the 2nd Platoon were able to reach them, forcing Savage and his soldiers to hold out on their own until well into the evening, when Pavin attacks finally ceased and the enemy began to withdraw. Even then, the platoon remained trapped behind enemy lines, cut off from any support. Specialist Galen Bungham, a veteran of the 2nd Platoon, later described his ordeal. We gathered up all of the magazines we could find and stacked them in front of us. There was no way we could dig a foxhole. The handle was blown off my entrenching tool, and one of my canteens had a hole blown through it. The fire was so heavy that if you tried to raise up to dig, you were dead. There was death and destruction all around. As the sun began to set and the fighting gradually died down, Colonel Moore requested reinforcements to shore up 1st Battalion's tenuous position. These came in the form of an additional company under Captain Myron F. Dodoric. With the help of Dodoric's men, the weary soldiers established a defensive perimeter and dug in, preparing to face a North Vietnamese counterattack the next morning. Meanwhile, the Pavin commanders were attempting to reorganize and rally their scattered forces. Colonel An had ordered the 66th Regiment to launch a nighttime attack on the American line, but the regiment's commissar, La Nak Cho, found the tired and malnourished troops almost impossible to control. No attack occurred that night, as both sides licked their wounds in pitch darkness, lit only by occasional flash of American shells exploding throughout the jungle. The next day, the Americans received much-needed supplies and reinforcements to further shore up their position. The PAVN renewed their assaults early in the morning, but they were largely held at bay by US air support. This included repeating strafing runs by fighter jets, but the more significant contribution came in the form of Operation Arclight, a massive bombing campaign carried out by Guam-based B-52 Stratofortress strategic bombers. These enormous planes were able to drop enough heavy ordnance on the enemy, or rather on a vast area roughly around the enemy, to prevent PAVN troops from launching any effective attacks on the American positions. With the help of this shielding curtain of annihilation, Colonel Moore was finally able to organize a rescue operation to recover the battered 2nd Platoon, bringing them back to LZ X-Ray and evacuating their many, many wounded. However, this security came at a cost. The danger-close ordnance the American planes were dropping included vast quantities of napalm, and this deadly and imprecise weapon proved almost as dangerous to their own soldiers as to the enemy. At one point, Moore's command post was struck by 2 napalm bombs, killing or wounding several of his men. Meanwhile, the PAVN 66th Regiment continued probing the Americans' defenses and trying to find a way through their aerial bombardment. By the morning of November 16th, these efforts had left the 66th all but shattered, and Colonel An ordered them to cease attacks on LZ X-Ray and withdraw. Once it became clear that the fighting was over, the 1st Battalion pulled back to a landing zone further from the front to be evacuated. While the battle over LZ X-Ray was finished, combat operations in the Drang Valley were still ongoing. The next day, November 17th, the 2 battalions remaining at LZ X-Ray set off on foot toward 2 other LZs in the vicinity. Of the 2 sites, one hosted an established defensible fire base, while the other, LZ Albany, was an empty clearing much like LZ X-Ray. The 2-7 Battalion arrived in this vulnerable position around 1 p.m., tired and demoralized from their long march through the dense jungle. Unfortunately for them, the Americans were not alone. The 8th Battalion of the PAVN 66th Regiment had spotted them on their trek and were waiting in ambush in the woods surrounding LZ Albany. This time, they made sure that the attack would be right in the face of the enemy, preventing the use of air support. As soon as the 2-7 entered the clearing, a barrage of machine guns and mortar fire tore through the unit, killing the closest soldiers before they even realized they were under attack. The Americans scrambled for cover, focusing their defense on 3 large termite mounds. Their situation swiftly went from bad to worse when another PAVN battalion arrived to flank their improvised defenses. Concealed within the forest, the North Vietnamese soldiers unloaded everything they had on the beleaguered US battalion, and their proximity meant the Americans were unable to rely on the air and artillery support that had turned the tide at LZ X-Ray. Split into 2 separate pockets, the 2-7 continued to hold out against the onslaught for the rest of the day, bolstered by the timely arrival of reinforcements in the evening. After nightfall, the fighting turned into a nightmarish game of cat and mouse, as PAVN soldiers spread out and scoured the battlefield, looking for wounded or isolated American soldiers that they could finish off. By the morning, however, it was over. The PAVN troops were exhausted and their supplies were almost fully depleted. As the sun rose, the North Vietnamese retreated into the jungle, leaving the 2-7, now reduced to less than half its previous strength, in possession of the blood-soaked battlefield. A handful more minor skirmishes occurred at other LZs in the valley in the following days, but the Battle of Ia Drang was over. When all was said and done, almost half of the 1,000 US soldiers who participated in the battle became casualties, with 237 killed and 258 wounded. The PAVN suffered heavier losses, with around 1,000 killed and over 500 wounded of their original 2,500 troops. But this was a sacrifice they were willing to make. The North Vietnamese, from that point on, learned how to exploit US forces' over-reliance on air and artillery support by keeping their attacks swift and close to the enemy, man to man, face to face. While American forces were successful in repelling B-3 Front's attack on the camp at Pleime and forcing them off the field, many could not help but see it as a Pyrrhic victory. The fiasco at LZ X-Ray proved that helicopter transports were of limited use in large-scale engagements, disappointing those who had placed their hopes in an air mobility doctrine. And even with overwhelming air superiority, the ambush of the 2-7 proved that the People's Army of Vietnam was a force to be reckoned with. The lessons learned by both sides at Ya Drang would go on to influence how they fought in the years of brutal war to come.